woman with a chance to make history.
I'm going to win an election by being what Georgians need.
I'm running for governor so that I can bring hope and opportunity to all Georgia families.
Both aiming to become the first woman to be the governor of Georgia. Today, we're getting them on the record about the most important issues to voters. Live from the WSB-TV studios in Midtown Atlanta, this is the gubernatorial debate for the Democratic primary. Here's your moderator, Justin Farmer.
Hello, and welcome to this live debate between the Democratic candidates for Georgia governor. This is their final debate before Tuesday's election. We also want to welcome those of you watching on WSB-TV.com and listening on WSB Radio. Let's meet our candidates. Each will have 1 minute for opening remarks. We determined the speaking order and podium position today by drawing. First, Stacey Abrams. Ms. Abrams is an attorney and former State House Minority Leader. Ms. Abrams, your opening remarks.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, WSB. I appreciate this opportunity to share with Georgia why I am the clear choice in this election. When I was growing up, my family struggled to stay above the poverty line, but we never struggled to know what was right. We knew that when you saw a problem, you solved it, especially the tough ones, because that's what leaders do. And for the last 20 years, I have done my best to lead the state of Georgia and help solve problems across the state. That's why I'm excited about the opportunity to become the governor who helps educate bold and ambitious children, builds a thriving and diverse economy across the state of Georgia, and helps lead a government that is responsive to everyone. I bring to this an unmatched experience as a business leader, as a political leader, and as a nonprofit executive. But most importantly, I come to this as a Georgian who understands that our best days lie ahead of us, and with the right leadership, we can go anywhere we want. Because I want to be the leader who makes certain that every Georgian has the freedom and the opportunity to thrive. And I look forward to answering your questions today to make certain you know that I'm the best choice to lead the state of Georgia.
Our next candidate, Stacy Evans. Ms. Evans, also an attorney and a former member of the State House from District 42 in Cobb County. Ms. Evans, your remarks.
Thank you for this opportunity. I've lived in Georgia my entire life. I was born and raised in Ringgold, Georgia by a single teenage mother. There were many times where we didn't have lights or water in our home because we couldn't always afford to pay those bills. We moved a lot. We lived in about 16 homes by the time I was 18 years old. There was drug abuse in my home, and there was domestic violence oftentimes. But because of the Hope Scholarship, I was able to change my circumstances and become the first in my family to go to college. I went to the University of Georgia. I stayed there for law school, where I met my husband, Andrew. We have a beautiful, energetic, and very smart daughter named Ashley, who's 6 years old and is watching at home. Hi, Ashley. Hope allowed me to have a beautiful family, allowed me to have an amazing career as an attorney, and allowed me to serve in the state legislature, the same body that some 20 years before I got there saw fit to invest in kids like me all across the state of Georgia who otherwise never could have afforded to go to college. Now I'm running for governor to bring the same hope and opportunity that was allotted to me to all Georgia families. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your votes on Tuesday.
Ms. Evans, I apologize. In your first couple of sentences, we didn't have your microphone all the way up, so I wanted to give you the opportunity, if you don't mind, what you said, your first couple of sentences, please.
I'm Stacey Evans, and I'm running for governor. I was born in Ringgold, Georgia. It's a small town up in the northwest corner of the state. I was born there to a single teenage mother. Many times we couldn't afford to pay the bills for our lights or water, and we moved a lot. We lived in about 16 different homes by the time I was 18 years old.
Ms. Evans,
I'm not sure where the sentences ended, but
no.
Hopefully you at home got enough of that to understand that I believe in hope very strongly, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and again, our apologies. Let's go over the ground rules today. Each candidate will have 1 minute to answer a question, 30 seconds for rebuttal at my discretion. To question the candidates today, I'm joined by our panel, WSB-TV political reporter Richard Elliott, WSB Radio Program Operations Manager Candace Presley, and Atlanta Journal-Constitution political reporter Greg Bluestein. Let's get started. I have our first question today, and this is for each of you. From Columbine to Sandy Hook, Parkland, Florida, and now Santa Fe, Texas, many Americans are starting to wonder if a school shooting tragedy is inevitable in their community. As governor of Georgia, what leadership would you provide to make specific changes for the safety of our children and our educators? Ms. Abrams, we begin with you.
As the next governor of Georgia, I will do what I've done for the past 11 years, and that is fight for gun safety. I come to this as someone who knows how to use a gun and who understands that the responsibility of owning a firearm imposes a higher obligation. And when I met with Miss Barbara Spencer when I was in Dahlonega, and she told me about her daughter who committed suicide because she was able to get a firearm with no waiting period. When I talk to families in Macon who are terrified of sending their children to school because of the violence in their communities, I know that I'm the best candidate because I'm the only one who has never received a B+ from the NRA. I have consistently voted against legislation that weakens gun laws and always voted to make gun safety better. I have a comprehensive plan on my website, but I'll tell you the top pieces. We have to make certain we ban assault weapons, which I co-sponsored in 2015. We have to roll back campus carry. We have to eliminate SB 350, which forces law enforcement to put guns on the streets, as my opponent voted for. And we have to be certain that we put in place common sense gun laws, background checks, extreme risk protective orders, and the things necessary to make certain families are taken care of and protected.
Ms. Evans.
Thank you. There are a lot of differences between the two of us in this campaign, but our stance on gun safety and reasonable gun legislation is not one of them. Let's set the record straight. I have a D from the NRA. I have a common sense gun candidate distinction from Moms Demand Action, and that is because they recognize my work to recognize the importance of gun safety and regulation in our state, and I'm proud of that record. Here's the reality. We are sending our kids to school every day in a society that we didn't grow up in. My daughter Ashley has to undergo intruder drills at her school. And to have her explain this to me broke my heart. They get as close to the floor as they can. They huddle as far against the wall as they can after having turned off the lights and closed the blinds, and they remain silent. I don't want my daughter to have to go through this. I don't want any of Georgia's children to go through this. That's why we need reasonable gun safety legislation. We need universal background checks. We need to ban bump stocks and silencers and high-capacity magazines. And we need to make it a top priority to get guns out of the homes when there is a protective order in a domestic violence situation.
Do you believe that more could be done at the school level as it relates to screening and monitoring and having an understanding of their students maybe a little bit better and relying on student bodies and teachers to try to find red flags and report on those? And I'll begin with you.
Well, I think that we want our teachers to be ever vigilant, but we are already demanding so much of our teachers. We entrust our children to the teachers and to the schools every day to teach them the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. We can't also expect our teachers to be safety officers and counselors. That's why I want to invest in a community school model that works to provide wraparound services in our schools so that teachers aren't doing it alone, so that we have nurses, social workers, so we have the folks in place to make sure that all of our kids' needs are met. And certainly, if you see something, say something. But my priority is making sure that our teachers are able to focus on teaching and our kids are able to focus on learning.
Ms. Abrams, what about resources for schools, whether it's mental health or administration that might have more assets to do something?
I think it's a combination of responsibilities. One is the expansion of Medicaid in the state of Georgia, because Medicaid dollars would allow us to invest in mental health services and substance abuse services early. That's the kind of preventative work and early intervention our children need. But we also have to understand that East SPLOST dollars, which pay for a lot of our school buildings, can't be used to actually protect those buildings. And I would work as governor to change the law to say that we can not only make our buildings safer, we can hire the personnel to ensure that that safety is true. But we also have to go a step further. We have to have positive behavioral interventions for our kids, because being mentally ill does not mean you're violent, and being violent does not mean you're mentally ill. And unfortunately, our teachers have been armed not with the resources they need to do the work, but with responsibilities they can't possibly meet. I will serve as the public education governor who protects not only our educators, but our children, to make certain that we are putting the proper amount of investment, the resources in place, but also that we're constantly monitoring for early intervention and for preventative measures.
Thank you. Richard Elliott, Channel 2.
This is a question for both of you, and it's somewhat related to that. You were talking about gun safety, trying to get common sense gun laws passed in the legislature. Were you to be elected governor, you would be a Democratic governor, probably likely with a Republican legislature. How do you work with a Republican, a more conservative Republican legislature to get not just gun safety, but other bills passed?
As the House Democratic leader, it's been my responsibility for the last 7 years to get good done working with Republicans wherever possible. And I'm proud to be the only person I know of who has an A rating from the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and got the Friend of Labor Award in the same year for the same work. Working with Republicans, I was able to pass legislation to protect our veterans. I was able to pass legislation to help kinship care families get the resources they need. I was able to secure for the first time in 40 years investment in transit through a Republican legislature. I was able to do that because I know that our responsibility is to work together for good, that often people don't care about your party, they care about their lives. And what I have done for the last 7 years as a leader, but the last 11 years as a legislator, is find moments of common opportunity. But that has never stopped me from blocking bad Republican bills when they showed up. It's why under my leadership, no trap legislation to harm reproductive freedom ever passed our legislature. It's why I was able to personally block a tax bill that would have raised $150 million on working families. I will work with anyone to get good done, but I will always stand in the way of doing the wrong thing.
Thank you. Let's try to keep our answers, if we could, to 1 minute. Ms. Evans?
Thank you. I will work with anyone of goodwill and good intention to do good for the state of Georgia. It's very important that any leader be willing to compromise, but we should never compromise our values. I worked with Republicans to help restore some of the disastrous cuts to the 2011 HOPE program, the cuts to HOPE in 2011. My opponent had sided with Republicans and compromised Democratic values to cut that program in 2011. Those cuts led to 97% of African American high school students losing access to full tuition HOPE scholarships and led to 40,000 students leaving our technical college system. That was a blow to the economy of this state to take so many that were on their way to get the skills and the training that they needed to get into the workforce and take them out of the system. That's why I worked across the aisle to restore those cuts, to expand the HOPE grant program, and I will work across the aisle again to make sure that our families are getting what they need, access to higher education, expanding Medicaid so that more have access to insurance, and working to improve our public schools so that every child has the education that they deserve.
Ms. Abrams, do you have a rebuttal?
I do. Unfortunately, my opponent continues to spread misinformation about what happened in 2011 and what happened after that. As leader, I fought to save HOPE, to make certain 100% of students with a B average have access to HOPE, to make certain that 500,000 children, 4-year-olds, continue to have access to pre-K. And then I co-sponsored the technical college legislation with my opponent, and she thanked me for my amazing leadership on that work. I credit Stacy Evans for doing good work on HOPE, but she has to admit she didn't do it alone.
Yes.
There's so much misinformation being put out here. Ms. Abrams did not ensure that 100% of those who had a B could get a HOPE scholarship. Before the cuts in 2011, nearly 250,000 students had access to a HOPE scholarship or grant. Even in her own commercial, she admits that today that number is 100,000. Those kids need HOPE. She worked with Republicans to save HOPE for those who were most likely to be able to go on and go to college anyway, and did not work to make sure that those that were least likely to be able to afford a college education were able to still access it, and that was wrong.
Let me ask each of you this. Republicans and Democrats in this state agree that HOPE has been a huge success and its economic viability is a must because for what it's done for education, but also business for our state. So I would like to ask each of you, do we need to take a fresh look at funding HOPE so that it's there in decades from now? Ms. Abrams?
The HOPE scholarship was in trouble in 2011 under Republican rule because the lottery was underfunded. That is a problem we will likely face again in the future if the economy ever goes down. But there is never going to be a question about my commitment to expanding HOPE. In fact, I'm the only one who has fought consistently for need-based aid, which is why I refused to sign a Republican bill to do gaming until they put into the constitutional amendment that need-based aid would be available. But more than that, I have consistently fought for the expansion of HOPE, working with Ms. Evans, working with Republicans, working with anyone who was willing to stand with me to expand access to higher education. But we have to go a step further. We have to talk about apprenticeships for those who are not going to go to college. We have to absolutely restore full technical college access. Associate's degrees have to be expanded, and we have to have need-based aid for all students. You shouldn't have to have a B to be successful in Georgia, which is what HOPE has always required. I believe in full expansion of HOPE, and I have co-sponsored every successful bill a Democrat has passed in the last 10 years to expand access to HOPE.
Ms. Evans, on this topic, though, how would we pay for it? In your administration, how can we make sure that it's economically viable?
Absolutely. Without HOPE, I simply could not be standing here today. I understand the paramount importance of making sure that the doors of higher education are closed to no one. There was never a financial reason in 2011 to even touch the Hope Grant to technical college. The average face of a technical college student when those cuts happened in 2011 was a 28-year-old mother from a household income of less than $20,000. Yet for only $20 million, we could have kept Hope Grants equaling full tuition for those families, and my opponent and the Republicans worked to change that. The lottery has the funds to take care of restoring Hope's original promise. And I am absolutely committed to needs-based aid in this state. I am the only candidate in this race that's ever put her name on a piece of legislation to bring needs-based aid to college. And it's really important that we understand not just the importance of the Hope Scholarship and opening up the doors to our four-year colleges, but also the Hope Grant, where before 2011, it didn't matter what your grades were. If you wanted to go to technical college, you could go and that cost would be covered. Republicans and my opponent changed that.
Thank you. Our next question, please, from Candace.
I'd like to stay on the Hope issue if we could, because I'm still unclear, and I suspect that maybe the voters are as well, as to which one of your claims is actually the right claim. Ms. Evans, you say she voted to gut Hope, and Ms. Abrams, you say you worked with Republicans to save the Hope Scholarship. So if I could ask just one more time for each of you to clarify this issue, because it's been quite confusing. Ms. Abrams.
Certainly. In 2011, if people remember, we were in the midst of an economic recession. The HOPE program, which is pre-K, technical college, and college, is funded by the lottery. And the lottery was in jeopardy, and no one denies that the lottery was going to run out of money. When that happened, we were also under Republican rule. Republicans controlled every statewide office, the governor's office. They had a supermajority in the Senate and were close to one in the House. The answer was not to simply say no. That would have been a symbolic response to hold on to what was passed and was not going to happen again. I went to work. I worked with Republicans, first fought with them, and finally got 3 concessions. One, that in addition to the Zell Miller Scholarship, which is a full tuition scholarship, there is also the Hope 2, which is the B average grant. Number 2, we saved pre-K for 500,000 students since 2011. Number 3, we saved remedial courses for technical college, and I then asked Representative Evans and Representative Craig Gordon to carry legislation to restore the 2.0. But on top of that, the 100,000 person number that my opponent uses is that's how many students got Hope last year. The reality is Hope is alive and well, and it is disingenuous to say anything else.
Ms. Evans.
The facts are these. Prior to the cuts in 2011, 250,000 Georgia students had a Hope Scholarship or a Hope Grant, nearly 250,000. Ms. Abrams just told you that right now that number stands at 100,000. You don't save the Hope Scholarship by cutting it. That's why the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus took a position against the legislation in 2011 that my opponent co-authored. That's why every single Democrat in the state Senate voted against that legislation, and that's why ultimately the majority of the Democrats in the House voted against it too. I have put forward 2 facts in this campaign. After those cuts, 97% of African American high school students lost access to full tuition Hope scholarships, and we awarded 60,000 fewer scholarships, and 40,000 students had to leave technical college. My opponent has not today or at any moment on this campaign trail refuted those facts because she can't. They are the facts. And I find it completely disingenuous that she continuously tries to take credit for what our hardworking preschool teachers did. They came to the Capitol and said, you cannot touch pre-K because that is our little children, that is getting them ready for kindergarten. They saved the pre-K program. Teachers are amazing.
Greg Bluestein.
Yeah, Ms. Abrams, I'd like to ask you a broader question. You built a reputation in the Georgia House as a pragmatist who could broker deals with the Republicans. You're running as an unapologetic progressive. How do you square those 2 images?
I've been the same person from the day I got to the legislature till today. If you look at the bills and the things we were able to accomplish, they've always been to pursue progressive values. I've worked to expand access to voting rights, to expand opportunities for kinship care, grandparents raising grandchildren, to stop a tax hike from Republicans on working families, to get money into the budget for our transit program, to do all of the things progressives want to see done. I'm the only candidate who has consistently co-sponsored or actually sponsored legislation on expanding the minimum wage, on expanding access to Medicaid. And I worked with President Barack Obama to make certain that occupational licenses were restored for ex-offenders. I served on the Criminal Justice Reform Committee because I know that we have to govern and we have to lead. But pragmatism isn't about abandoning your values. It's about working with the other side to make sure those values have life. and to make sure that the people who are affected by those challenges have the services they need. I do not see any difference between where I stood then and where I stand now, except that now, rather than leading 62 members of the House of Representatives, I'm running to lead all 10 million Georgians.
Let's talk about immigration if we could. Whoever wins in your primary will be facing a Republican candidate, some of whom have had TV commercials with a deportation bus and saying they're going to round people up, that kind of thing. I highly doubt that's a strategy either of you would employ, but I will ask you this. Do you acknowledge in Georgia that there's an immigration and an illegal immigration challenges? And if you believe that there are challenges, what might you do in your administration to make the system work better for Georgia? Ms. Evans?
Here are the facts. I spoke with a young dreamer a few days ago who wanted help getting a driver's license. He didn't know how to start the process. He didn't want to go down to the DMV to ask the questions because he was afraid. The Republican candidates for governor have created a fear-mongering situation. They are pandering to the far right of their primary. It is disgusting, and it is hateful, and it creates an unwelcoming state that is not going to be the kind of state where we're going to be able to attract the kind of jobs that will give families access to good, dependable jobs that pay fair wages. The truth is, less than 4% of those living in Georgia are undocumented individuals. We rely on the immigrant community for so many things in the state. 25% of our doctors, 25% of our technology workers, 25% of our skilled tradesmen, 50% of our farmers. For those who have come here to seek a better life, who are living by the rules, who are trying to contribute to society, to put them in a position where they are in fear is absolutely disgusting, and I call on the Republicans to be better.
Ms. Abrams, on immigration,
Certainly.
do there need to be changes?
So federal immigration is an issue, and we need our leadership, both sides of the aisle, to come together with smart, thoughtful policies that create a pathway to citizenship and a pathway to legalization. But the state of Georgia should never be involved in the enforcement of federal immigration law. Our law enforcement should be focused on service and protection, and you cannot do that when families are afraid to report crimes or to serve as witnesses because they're terrified of what could happen to their families. But we also have to serve those children who are graduating from our high schools, who deserve the opportunity to go to every one of our state colleges. And I'm very ashamed of the Supreme Court's decision not to allow their attendance. But I also recognize that we have to invest in small businesses that are run by immigrants. And unfortunately, our immigration laws at a local level, HB 87, have weakened our ability to serve all of our communities. I've worked with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, with the Asian American community, with the Caribbean community. I've worked with all of these groups and with the Nigerian community to make certain that we are constantly thinking about how we make Georgia a more welcoming place to do business and to live.
Our next question from Richard Elliott.
I wanted to ask back a little bit toward hope. The Supreme Court recently ruled that it is now the states can decide whether or not they want to have sports gambling, and that will probably bring up the issue of casinos again, casino gambling in Georgia. The last version that we saw would help fund hope. Is that something, I'll start with you, Ms. Evans, that you would support to see the casino gambling in the state of Georgia if it went toward funding hope?
Absolutely. I'm in favor of bringing casinos and sports gaming to this state and horse racing as well, if we dedicate the funds to fill an opportunity gap that exists. And right now, we do have one when it comes to needs-based aid. Without financial aid, I could not have gone to college. I want to make sure that the doors of higher education are closed to no one. We're going to have to invest in needs-based aid. I'm proud to be the only candidate in this race that's ever signed a bill that would put needs-based aid in the state of Georgia. Because here's the reality. We have a skills gap in this state. We have fewer Georgians with higher ed credentials than we need to attract the kind of jobs that we want over the next few decades. The only way that we're going to catch up is to make sure that every Georgian can afford college. That means we're going to need to invest in needs-based aid. And I see casinos, sports gaming, and horse racing as a way that we can fill the gap and make sure that the doors of higher education are closed to no one.
Ms. Abrams.
Part of leadership is using the tools at your disposal. And as the leader of the House Democratic Caucus, I refuse to sign any piece of legislation that did not also put into the constitutional amendment protection for dollars to go to need-based aid. And while my opponent was a state representative who was certainly free to sign legislation, as leader, it was my obligation to hold back any consent until we had everything we needed in the constitutional amendment. Because the reality is the Republicans can change the legislation whenever they want, but once it's in the Constitution, that's where it stays. But I believe that need-based aid has to be first and foremost. I think that we should give the public the right to vote, but I think that it only happens when the constitutional amendment reflects a dedicated source of revenue to need-based aid, to full pre-K funding, and to the other issues that we face in the state of Georgia. As the next governor, I will refuse to allow any legislation to move forward that does not include that, which is why I was able to block casino gaming for 2 years, because they refused to put that information in the constitutional amendment.
Our next question, please, from WSB's Candace.
Ladies, the Lieutenant Governor's promised to cut taxes again and still create more jobs if elected. What is your stand on cutting taxes, and what are your plans, your top 2 or 3 priorities for growing Georgia's economy if elected? And we'll start with you, Ms. Abrams.
We have a responsibility to put money into the pockets of our families and to make certain that all of our businesses have the ability to thrive. That means making smart, thoughtful investments in infrastructure, in expansion of economic development, and in education. I would not vote to, or would not sign legislation to further reduce our investment in our state. The reality is we have major issues that we haven't funded. We have teachers who are underpaid. We have educators and paraprofessionals who are living at or below the poverty line. We have to expand Medicaid to save rural hospitals, and we have to make investments across the state of Georgia in helping small businesses. Because as excited as I am about bringing Amazon and those 50,000 jobs, I'm more excited about the possibility of investing in 5,000 small businesses across Georgia, helping each of them create 10 new jobs. Those are 50,000 jobs that will never leave our state. The issue of cutting taxes is a false argument, because what Georgia needs is investment. We need to invest in our people, invest in broadband, invest in our rural communities, and invest in tomorrow.
Are you saying then you would not be in favor of a tax cut?
I would not.
Go ahead.
Certainly. I would not be in favor of cutting taxes in Georgia any further, because right now Georgia has a AAA bond rating. If we cut taxes further, we risk destabilizing that AAA bond rating, which means it's going to cost every Georgian more to live here. It is a nice thing to talk about, but it's the wrong-headed move. And as the Democratic leader, but also as a tax attorney with a specialty in tax policy, I can tell you that when our AAA bond rating comes under review again, that review is going to look at whether or not we can afford to do the things we're responsible for: education, transportation, law enforcement. And if we further reduce our tax base, we cannot meet those obligations.
Ms. Evans, on this topic that you brought up, Candace, when we talk about tax cuts and what they do or don't do, you can have smart people debate that for hours. One thing we do know in our state is that when there were tax considerations made, incentives for the film industry, we saw what happened. It blossomed and it creates jobs and all that. What is your feeling on what Candace asked in regard to, about taxation?
Well, Georgia has one of the lowest state income tax rates in the country, and I see no reason that needs to change. But what does need to change is that government has to focus on its job so that business can work to create new jobs, and so that families can live, work, and play in the kind of environment that we all want Georgia to be. And when the government doesn't do its job, then the other parts don't work. Government has a role to invest in infrastructure, like our transportation infrastructure. We need a coordinated regional mass transit system here in the city of Atlanta and Metro Atlanta at large. But transit's not just something for Metro Atlanta. The rest of the state has to be a part of it as well. We need to build out commuter rail lines that connect the smaller cities to each other and to Atlanta. That sets up an environment that not only puts folks to work building out the infrastructure, but also puts every region of Georgia in play when a company is looking for a new place to locate. And Georgia has to invest in the infrastructure of our healthcare system. We need more Georgians with the assurance of insurance. That starts with expanding Medicaid, which would immediately cover 500,000 Georgians with insurance, so that we have a healthy workforce to support these jobs that we all want to create here in the state of Georgia.
A follow-up on the tax question. Georgia lawmakers passed, this is for both of you, passed an income tax cut this year that will cut taxes by an estimated $330 million over the next half decade. Would you work to reverse those cuts if elected, or would you work to keep them in place? Ms. Evans, you first.
Well, I wish that the Republican leadership had waited to see how things were going to shake out with the federal changes to the tax code. Those happened quickly, and I wish that we had waited to see exactly what the results would be before we put the state budget in jeopardy. But at this point, I would like to wait and see. I feel confident that those of goodwill and good mind can find ways to fund the priorities in the state of Georgia. I believe that we need to look at every dollar and make sure it's going to its highest and best use. We need to always be willing to root out the fraud, the waste, and abuse that keeps dollars from going to their best use. As a private attorney, I fought against fraud, waste, and abuse in the Medicare system and was able to recover over $300 million for taxpayers. I'll bring that same fight to the state of Georgia to make sure that we are scouring the budget and we are looking closely at every dollar to making sure that it's being spent to invest in people, transportation, and health care.
I would actually say this. There's a difference between tax cuts and tax incentives. A tax cut is someone taking part of your paycheck away. A tax incentive is taking away a bonus. And here's the reality. When we cut taxes, income taxes in the state of Georgia, we're reducing half of the revenue to the state. My mission is to always invest in what we are supposed to do as Georgians. That means expanding Medicaid, which will cost us $156 million a year to draw down almost $1 billion. It means investing in education. For me, that means diverting those dollars back to the general coffers, the $100 million that are being spent on private school education. Those are dollars that should go to our teachers and our schools. It means investing in our roads, but also investing in transit. It means investing in broadband in rural communities. And so I think that we have to absolutely look at how do we make certain the revenue is available to do the work we need to do, putting money back into the pockets of families, helping workers build the companies and the businesses they need to build, helping small businesses do what they must, but always investing for the future in the state of Georgia. Tax incentives and tax cuts are different, and I believe that we have to make certain we're paying for what we need to do.
Thank you both. When we return, the candidates will have the chance to question each other. That is next when the gubernatorial debate for the Democratic primary continues. We welcome you back on this Sunday, our live debate between the Democratic candidates for Georgia governor on WSB-TV, WSB-TV.com, and WSB Radio. Now, this is the fun part. We get the candidates to ask each other a question. Each candidate will have 20 seconds to ask that question, and then they'll be able to ask a couple of questions each. And there's a 1-minute response for each of you, and then 30 seconds if the other candidate would like to then have a rebuttal. We determine the order by drawing, and the first question comes from Stacy Evans.
Thank you. Ms. Abrams, access to voting is one of the most core democratic principles, and we should be expanding it, not cutting it. In 2011, there was a national Republican effort against Obama's re-election for 2012 that included cuts to early voting. Why did you not only vote with Republicans to cut early voting, but also co-sign the legislation?
Certainly. In 2012, we had a bipartisan group of legislators, city council members, county commissioners, and state legislators who came to the Georgia General Assembly and said that we had 45 days of early voting, but only 21 days were really being used. However, small communities like Alma, Georgia, were being asked to do the exact same thing as the city of Atlanta, to keep those days open, to have 3 full-time staffers, to keep the buildings open when no one was coming inside. And rather than reduce opportunities for voting, what we did together, bipartisan and across racial lines, was to reduce the number of days of voting to meet the national standard of 21 days. But because I understand how critical voting rights are, because I fought for voting rights my entire adult life, I made certain that we added a mandatory Saturday to ensure that families could vote when they had a day off. That's why I am proud of the work that I've done on voting rights, not only to secure access to the right to vote through registering more than 200,000 Georgians, but to also make certain that whether you live in a small town in Georgia or in the biggest city in the state, you have the right to vote for 21 days.
The truth is, early voting helped Obama in 2008, and Republicans were scared that it would propel him to another re-election in 2012. And thank goodness we were able to do it anyway, despite what my opponent did with Republicans to cut early voting. It's very frustrating that she continues to use Republican talking points to justify what she did. She claims to be the progressive champion, but her record shows differently, whether it was working with Republicans to cut the Hope Scholarship or working with them to cut early voting periods. The rhetoric on this campaign is very different from her record.
Rebuttal on this for your question.
I would look at my record on voting rights and say that I have registered more than 200,000 people. I have helped stop really draconian cuts to early voting after that time. I made certain that Democrats and Republicans across the state of Georgia, whether you were in Atlanta and Fulton County or down in Taylor County, that you weren't forced to lay off workers in order to meet a service that folks were not using. These aren't Republican talking points. These are facts. These are numbers. And if you go to the website for the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia, they have a fact page that talks about why we made that effort in 2012.
Ms. Abrams, you have a question.
Certainly. Ms. Evans, you have publicly stated your support for Medicaid expansion, but we also know that you have failed to categorically reject work requirements. If Republicans make work requirements a mandatory piece of a compromise for Medicaid expansion, will you agree to work requirements or will you say no?
What I have said, that I find it absolutely frustrating and sad that Republicans want to perpetuate a stereotype that those that receive Medicaid don't work. I simply reject their premises. The truth is, I will fight to make sure that every Georgian has access to insurance, because I lived most of my life without insurance, and I understand the uncertainty and the fear that that creates for families. So I want more Georgians to have the assurance of insurance. That starts with expanding Medicaid, attracting those 50,000 jobs that expanding Medicaid would bring, and it would allow us to go in the direction which is opposite of what's going on right now, to make more health care services available. We've had 8 hospitals close in this state since Georgia made what I believe is the immoral decision not to expand Medicaid. And we can help those hospitals reopen those doors by making sure that they have more patients that are able to afford the health care services that they receive. The hospital that I was born in has been on the brink of foreclosure 3 times in the last decade. I am committed to making sure that we expand insurance coverage for all Georgians.
Ms. Evans, your second question for Ms. Abrams.
Thank you. Ms. Abrams, when asked about your private business dealings with the Republican administration while you were minority leader, you've repeatedly stated that you were walled off from any dealings with the state. Why then did you represent your company when lobbying the state for hundreds of millions of dollars?
I did not, and I have never done so. The reality is that I started a company in the midst of the Great Recession, a company that helped President Obama put money into the pockets of small businesses that were struggling to stay alive. And through our efforts, we were able to extend credit to 350 small businesses to create or retain more than 2,000 jobs. But before I did any of that, I made certain that I was not a part of any conversations with the state of Georgia. This was a federal program from President Barack Obama that was administered through the state. But even though the law allowed me to participate, I told my company and the state I would not participate. We have absolutely no relationship with the state that I was a part of. However, as every small business owner who works at the state capitol knows, you still have to make a living. And as a member of my company, I went before the Fulton County Board to talk about a tax policy and to talk about a bond deal. And that bond deal was absolutely a part of my responsibility and did not violate any state or federal laws. But more importantly, it was necessary to help get jobs created in Georgia.
You have just admitted that you did, in fact, insert yourself on lobbying to get business for your company from the government. And that is wrong. Yes, we all need to make a living, but not through our government service. I have never taken a dime from the government other than my legislative salary and my expenses. And that's what Georgia voters want to know. They want to know that you are negotiating on their behalf when you were in state government and not on your own. And the truth is, while you were working with Republicans to gut the Hope Scholarship and cut early voting, you had a private business that's livelihood was dependent on Republican approval, and you hid it from the Democratic caucus.
I'll give you a chance if you have anything.
Thank you, I do. It is a sad day when Democrats use Republican words and Republican trickery to try to win elections. I ran a small business like most legislators in the General Assembly. I had a company that had a great idea, and we worked with President Barack Obama's administration to get access to capital in the midst of the Great Recession. Now, at the time I was doing that, my opponent was working for Countrywide, a company that's been listed as one of the worst companies in America because of what they did to decimate the mortgage industry. I am proud of what I did during the Great Recession, and I am proud of my leadership as the Democratic leader who helped Georgia.
All right, I'll give you 15 seconds, yes.
I would like 30.
Yes,
She's hit
that's
me.
right.
Absolutely. I'm not engaging in trickery. She has just admitted that she lobbied on behalf of her company to the government. If you want to draw a distinction between county and state, I don't think that's one that the voters are going to appreciate. But let me say this, and I find it really sad, Ms. Abrams, that you would talk about this countrywide case, because that was a case I worked on as a young associate at a large law firm, and you worked for a large law firm too, and I didn't dig through and see every case that you might have appeared on the pleadings on. The truth is, I was on this case for maybe 2 months. I don't remember doing any work on it because I left the firm shortly after I was put on these pleadings to stand up for a brave doctor and a nurse who blew the whistle on Medicare fraud allegations at a national dialysis chain, and I recovered over $300 million for the taxpayer. So I am extremely proud of my record as an attorney, and I am very disheartened that my opponent would try to mischaracterize my legal career.
Ms. Abrams, chance for your next question.
Absolutely. More than 80% of the state budget in the state of Georgia, Ms. Evans, is spent on education, healthcare, transit, transportation, and on human services. And right now, I think we would both agree they're underfunded. You've repeatedly said that you would pay for these things through waste and inefficiency. Can you give us specific examples of waste and inefficiency that would actually fund education, healthcare costs, and the things we need to pay for in the state of Georgia?
I will give you a very specific example of something that I found as a state legislator when I was fighting to restore the disastrous HOPE cuts that you and the Republicans created in 2011. I have been working the entire time I was in the legislature to make the HOPE grant once again cover full tuition at our technical colleges. It would have cost about $20 million. I looked at the lottery audits, I looked at every line of those budgets, and I found that $60 million new dollars had been coming into the lottery every year since those cuts that we didn't spend. So in other words, we could have paid to restore the HOPE grant to full tuition 3 times. And I wish that you had spent the time looking as closely as I did before you signed on to those disastrous cuts with the Republicans in 2011.
When we return, more questions from our panel and from you, the viewers. So keep it here. That's next when the gubernatorial debate for the Democratic primary continues. And we welcome you back on this Sunday afternoon to our live debate between the Democratic candidates for Georgia governor on WSB-TV, WSB-TV.com, and WSB Radio. We have more questions now from our panel. Let's go to Channel 2's Richard Elliott.
We talked a little bit about the film industry and incentives. Of course, the one everyone is talking about is Amazon. 50,000 high-paying jobs, $5 billion investment. And the governor's talked about calling a special session because the incentives may be so big. What incentives should the state give, and is there some point where it's counterproductive, where we're losing more than we're getting? We'll start with Ms. Evans.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I hope that Lieutenant Governor Cagle's threats against Delta did not sink our opportunity to attract Amazon here. We want those 50,000 high-paying jobs for the state of Georgia and the growth that will follow. Anytime we are talking about giving out tax credits and incentives, we need to be mindful and make sure that Georgians are getting the benefit of the bargain. Certainly, the film tax credits have been an amazing win for this state, and we should do everything that we can to continue to strengthen that program. We need to also utilize tax credits and incentives to help our small businesses. Those that want to start and grow small businesses, particularly outside of the Atlanta area, should have access to compete as well. But wherever we are using these incentives and credits, we need to always make sure that we are following up and making sure that Georgians got the jobs that they were promised and that we had the growth that we were promised. And if not, then somebody's going to owe the state of Georgia some money. That's why I want to set up a permanent commission that will constantly evaluate and make sure that Georgians are getting the benefit of any bargain that we make on their behalf.
An important part of bringing Amazon to Georgia is having a Georgia Amazon wants to be in. And that's why my focus would not only be on tax accountability, which is an important part of our conversation, making certain that the investment is worth the return, but it's also making certain that we are using these jobs to create pathways for prosperity for those who work there, making certain that those jobs pay a good wage, that there's no wage theft or misclassification. And that's why I'm proud to introduce legislation to hold those who misclassify workers accountable. But it's also about making certain we're investing in education. That's why I would oppose any tax incentives that take money out of our public school system. Because as a public education governor, I would absolutely stand always on the side of investing in our students. But we also have to make certain that they're investing in our healthcare system. That's why Medicaid expansion will be so critical, because we have to make sure that every Georgian has the freedom and opportunity to thrive through a good education, a good job, and access to health care. And as the only candidate here who has sponsored tax accountability legislation, wage theft legislation, and good tax legislation, I look forward to being the governor to make this happen.
And I wanted to ask one quick follow-up question, if I might. We've heard about too much of a good thing, too much success from Amazon. Housing prices go up. Some folks who live in neighborhoods may no longer be able to live there. As governor, would you take steps to limit any type of economic impact that would have on some of these potential neighborhoods? Ms. Abrams first.
When it comes to the issue of bringing new jobs and new opportunities into a community, we have to think about affordability. I live in a community that has gone through gentrification, and one of the solutions is to make certain that we have a circuit breaker, saying that even if the costs go up, if your income doesn't also rise, you don't pay more. But we also have to invest in housing trust funds to make certain Georgia's always participating and making sure that access to those jobs does not mean giving up a good lifestyle. But Amazon is only part of the challenge. We have to look at the entire state of Georgia. Affordability is an issue in Valdosta as well as in Vinings. And that means we have to use the resources Georgia has to ensure that affordability is always available. I've put forward very comprehensive proposals on economic mobility and childcare so that we're constantly putting money back in the pockets of our families. Because the reality is, no matter what job comes to Georgia, if it doesn't pay a good wage, if it doesn't pay a living wage, it's not worth the investment in our state.
We absolutely have to be mindful that as we are creating progress, we are not leaving anyone behind. And that has been an issue all across the state, and I am committed to make sure that we are looking at every angle when we're talking about growing our economy. And affordable housing is a problem now. It was a problem before we started talking about Amazon, and we need to make sure that we don't let it get any worse. I will be looking forward to working with local governments and doing everything that we can to make sure that there are correct affordable housing tax credits in place, looking to draw down federal funds to help us with this issue, and being open to public and private partnerships to make sure that no one is priced out of the community that they built. This is an issue particularly with our seniors, and I think that we need to work to protect our seniors who have built communities, built homes. They should not be forced out as they are aging, and that's why I am in favor of responsible tax exemption for seniors across the state of Georgia for those that are in need. And my opponent is the only member of the legislature from either party, I believe, in either chamber to vote against this type of legislation to protect seniors in the city of Decatur. I will always work to protect our seniors and make sure affordable housing is a reality for everyone.
Yes.
In 2017, there was legislation put forward that would have exempted seniors from paying property taxes for education. And here's my bottom line. We all benefit from good public education in the state of Georgia, no matter where we live. And I have been very consistent. I have never voted to exempt anyone from paying for public education, because public education saved my family's life. It's why my mother was one of 7 children, the only one to go to college. It's why my father was able to go to college as the first man in his family. It's why I have been able to go to Spelman College and the University of Texas and Yale Law School. I will always defend public education, no matter who needs the money.
Yes. Yes.
As a proud product of Georgia's public schools all the way from kindergarten until I got my law degree at the University of Georgia, I personally understand the paramount importance of public education and how it changes lives. So do many of my other colleagues down from the legislature, and certainly all of my Democratic colleagues who joined together to make sure that Decatur seniors were protected. And the truth is, it was the Decatur school system who was asking us to push this legislation through, because the schools were getting overcrowded and they wanted to diversify the age of those that were living within the city limits. So this was a responsible step, and unfortunately my opponent, as in many other situations, thought she knew better, as against every single other person in the legislature.
We need our next question, please, Candace Presley.
Leader Abrams, you probably will respond to that as I ask you this question. Your opponent has argued that your strategy in this campaign is all wrong, that you are not working to convert the right voters, and then there's that whisper campaign that suggests that statewide Georgia will not elect a single African-American female as governor. How do you respond to those attacks as you make your closing argument to the voters?
As I make my closing argument to the voters, I've done the first job, which is go and talk to all of the voters. My campaign has spent our resources investing in voters, investing in conversation. I've traveled across the state again and again, from Dalton to DeSoto, from Hepzibah down to Jessup. And we've gone throughout the city of Atlanta and the metro area because I believe that the way to win as a progressive is to talk to progressives. But I also talk to conservatives, to moderates, to anyone who will listen, because I think our proposals and our policies are what's best for Georgia. I want every Georgian to have the freedom and opportunity to thrive. And I don't think my skin color, my marital status, or my background, other than the background of being someone who has worked hard to serve Georgia for the last 11 years, should be the deciding factor. The bottom line is this: I am the most qualified candidate, Democrat or Republican, running for this office. I'm the only one who's been a Democratic leader, who's had to make tough decisions, but has always stood on the principle that we have to help our families do better. I'm the only one who, during the Great Recession, helped create jobs in the state of Georgia. And I'm the only one who's registered hundreds of thousands of Georgians to lift up their voices in our body politic.
All right, we are in an interesting situation. We have about 90 seconds before we need to get to your closing remarks. So I'm going to have Greg ask a question, if y'all promise for brief answers on whatever you're asking.
Yeah, I'll do it directly to Ms. Evans. You're one of a small number of Democrats in the legislature to support the governor's Opportunity School District program for struggling schools. While many in your party worried it would give the state too much power to intervene in local affairs, why did you take that stance, and do you regret it?
I have said on this campaign that I do regret that vote because I misunderstood the deep distrust between the state government and the education community. I voted for that legislation to be responsive to my home district. I represent a part of Cobb where schools have a high population of those who are economically challenged, and those parents wanted a way to get their local school board to pay attention to their schools as opposed to the more affluent schools on the East Cobb side of town, and I wanted to be responsive to their needs. But I look forward to working to create a community school model in this state, one that works to address the problems that are keeping students from learning in the classroom, like when they're coming to school without the eyeglasses they need, or the hearing aids that they need, or they're hungry, or there's violence at home. We can't expect teachers to solve these problems all by themselves, and that's why I'm proud to be endorsed by the Georgia Federation of Teachers and to stand with them to make education policy that will ensure that every child is able to focus on learning and every teacher is able to focus on teaching.
Thank you. It is now time for our closing remarks. Each candidate will have 1 minute. We determined to order by drawing today. And first, Stacy Evans.
Thank you. I've lived in Georgia my entire life. I've talked to fellow Georgians as a neighbor who is also struggling, as a legislator who is trying to open the doors of higher education to more, and now as a candidate for governor, looking to bring hope and opportunity to all Georgia families. And in those conversations, I see what you at home know, which is that a lot of folks are doing well, but many more are struggling, and that Georgia is full of amazing and resilient people. Like a teacher I met at a local technical college who told me that after the cuts to the Hope Scholarship and Grant program, she started keeping cash in her desk drawer so that she could make up the gap between what a student could pay and what tuition was covered now by the grant, so that if she could keep someone from dropping out, she would do it. She couldn't save all of them, but as a state we can. I will be a governor that fights tirelessly to open up the doors of opportunity to more, whether that is restoring tuition-free technical college, expanding Medicaid, raising minimum wage, or making our public education system one that will ensure that every child gets the education they deserve. I look forward to your vote on Tuesday.
Stacey Abrams.
Well, I again want to say thank you to all who are watching. Elections are about choices, and we have a choice that's very clear in this campaign. The question of who has the proven leadership, the experience, and the judgment to become the next governor of Georgia. I know that we don't lead single-issue lives, and we can't run single-issue campaigns. And that is why I have spent the last 11 months traveling the state of Georgia, talking to voters, doing what I did for 11 years as a state legislator, doing what I did for 7 years as House Democratic leader. And that's going everywhere, whether there are 5 Democrats or 5,000, whether there are only 5 people in the room, regardless of their party, talking to them about their needs. And I know they want us to educate bold and ambitious children. They want us to build a thriving and diverse economy in all 159 counties. They want to absolutely be certain that they have a proven leader to lead the state forward. And I know that I have a campaign and a vision that will help every Georgian have the freedom and opportunity to thrive, not only in May, but all the way through to the next generation. Thank you so much, and please vote for Stacey Abrams on May 22nd.
Thanks to each of you for being here today, and thank you for being here for Georgia's voters. It means a lot. And thank you for joining us for what we hope has been an informative hour. The winner from the Democratic primary Tuesday will face the Republican winner in November. And you will hear from the Republican candidates here in their debate next. Coming up in just minutes, please keep it here on Channel 2 for the Republican debate. A reminder, Election Day is Tuesday. We'll have in-depth coverage throughout the day and evening, including complete results here on Channel 2, on WSB-TV.com, and on our mobile app. I'm Justin Farmer. Hope you have a wonderful Sunday. Thanks again for joining us. The Republicans will debate next.